This week on LTC News, last call in Lowell.
I think the city's painting with a very broad brush. I think they're going to punish a lot of responsible businesses because of the actions of a few.
Changes to come at Lowell General Hospital.
One of the questions we get asked most frequently since 2012 is what's happening at the Saints campus, and is the Saints campus closing? And we say absolutely and very strongly no.
And celebrating women's suffrage.
So there are famous photographs of women in Washington, D.C., and they're marching on the streets. Some of them actually get put into jail, and they are force-fed.
All this and much more on this edition of LTC News. Welcome to LTC News. I'm your host, Krista Brown. It was 100 years ago that women finally got the right to vote in the United States. The women's suffrage movement started in the 1830s and took almost a century to come to fruition. Lowell women were very much involved in the struggle. To learn more, we spoke with Lowell National Historical Park Ranger, Allison Horrocks.
June of 1919, the United States Congress passed the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, and this was to allow women access to the right to vote. And it wasn't fully ratified until August 18th of 1920. So this year we'll be celebrating the 100th anniversary of that 19th Amendment and opening and expanding access to women for the right to vote. Decades earlier, in 1870, on February 3rd, the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was ratified, and that expanded access to all free black men, including those who had been held in bondage under slavery. That actually really caused a big gap in social movements, particularly in places like Lowell, where women were very politically active early on, as early as the 1830s. A social cause that a lot of them rallied around was abolition, ending slavery. So when the 15th Amendment passes, it's kind of a partial victory for the movement. All women, including women of color, are still excluded from that right to vote. It's going to be 50 years between these two amendments passing. So there are people who fight pretty much their whole lives, some of whom don't even see this 19th Amendment actually pass. From the very beginning in the 1830s, when women started to turn out from their jobs, when they started to get active by writing petitions and fighting for other causes, women who earned money by working in a factory, some of them used that money not just to buy things for themselves, but to support causes like abolition, to buy newspapers like The Liberator, and they wanted to use their capital for social causes. This is what led some women to want the right to vote as well. So Florence Luscombe and Alice Parker Lesser were big deals in women's suffrage, and they're both from Lowell. Alice Parker Lesser was actually one of the first women in the state of Massachusetts to be a lawyer, and she was a graduate of Lowell High School. She fights in Boston quite a bit for equal access to voting rights and is a big voice in the state. Harriet Hanson Robinson, who started as a mill girl in the 1830s, writes the first history of women's suffrage in Massachusetts, which was very important at the time. Sadly, she died 9 years before women's suffrage passed, but she had been fighting at that point for 50 years for women's suffrage. There were many arguments against women's suffrage, one of which was that this would lead to a lot more divorce, that women would neglect their children, that women would not want to fight with men in politics. Really a core argument was that women not just were incapable of engaging in politics, but that they wouldn't want to anyway. So it was hardly a united front when that referendum happened in 1915 and when suffrage passed 5 years later. So there are famous photographs of women in Washington, D.C., and they're marching on the streets. Some of them actually get put into jail, and they are force-fed. And there is a huge backlash against these women But then the tide turns a bit because the violence that's committed against them in the jails is so extreme. And Wilson, who had been against suffrage, really has to turn with the tide. And the critical mass of women almost storming the White House. That was the first time that had been done. Women pioneered protesting in front of the White House. They really brought it home to him in a way that was very hard to ignore. And that was new for the time.
Check out the National Parks website for details on upcoming events about voting rights throughout the year. Last November, the public learned of an agreement between the Turnkey landfill in Rochester, New Hampshire, and the Lowell Regional Wastewater Utilities Duck Island facility that permitted the landfill to send runoff containing a chemical known as perfluorinated alkylated substances to the Lowell wastewater facility. These PFAs are also known as forever chemicals because they never break down and are considered dangerous to the environment. The agreement caused a public outcry, which led to the city suspending the contract. We spoke with City Manager Eileen Donahue about the city's position.
So the city of Lowell started to accept leachate landfill from Turnkey, which is located up in Rochester, New Hampshire, back in 2013. It was an arrangement that had been going on for a number of years, and out of an abundance of caution, we decided to suspend for the time being, and we'll see where that goes. The role of the federal government, I think, is an interesting question. I think some feel that the federal government could be more proactive in requiring places, for instance, like Turnkey, to have filters in place to filter things like PFAS out of the leachate before it's delivered to a plant such as Lowell. Those are ongoing discussions, and it's very possible that Turnkey will decide to do something like that, but that's obviously up to them. There's certainly a financial impact to the city by not accepting the leachate. I hesitate to quote an exact figure, but it's significant monies that the city will forego if we continue in not accepting the leachate from Turnkey.
We also spoke with Mark Young, Executive Director of Lowell's Water Utility Department.
PFAS, a group of man-made chemicals that have been used for a variety of applications in both industry and households for years. They've been used since the 1940s, and they're very abundant in today's society. And these chemicals are widely used because they're very and exceptionally resistant to heat, water, and oil. Lowell and most of the drinking water facilities along the Merrimack River have the ability to filter PFAS out of the drinking water. And the technology that we use is called carbon filtration. So we have a certain type of carbon that can absorb the PFAS and other constituents in the water and hold it so it doesn't get released back into the drinking water. And for Lowell residents, luckily, we have a surface water. We don't take from wells. And what research has been finding that unless there's a factory that makes PFAS nearby, that the results in most rivers are pretty low. The results are low. Lowell's drinking water source, drinking water supply, and the treatment process makes our water very safe. And we have exceptional water. It tastes good, and it's safe. So do not have concerns about drinking Lowell tap water.
On January 21st, the city requested that Police Superintendent Richardson provide a report on actions that could be taken to address violence in the downtown district when the bars close. The council asked if closing the bars earlier would mitigate the problem, but local businesses had their own ideas about an earlier closing time. In this next segment, we'll hear from a few of our local bar owners and customers on how they view the problem.
I think the city's painting with a very broad brush. I think they're going to punish a lot of responsible businesses because of the actions of a few.
You know, every place has their own kind of way of doing things and way of operating. We personally do not allow anybody in after 1 a.m. However, we would like our patrons that are already here to be able to relax and finish up and have a drink.
But we've taken steps with our business model to make sure that we're attracting the right type of clientele, even in the wee small hours of the morning.
So part of the reason it's a concern is I know that there are a couple of places that are problematic, but it feels like their solution is to punish everybody instead of concentrating the punishment on the people that are causing the issue to begin with.
I think it would be pretty easy to hold those people accountable for breaking those rules without having to hold everybody else accountable.
My thought is that it would feel like a punishment to responsible establishments that have been doing the right thing the whole time and are frustrated with events that go on.
If word gets out, like if people start to think the reason why we're closing down early is because Lowell has something like a violence problem, that's also going to send a message to people that Lowell is not a good place to choose for your nighttime entertainment.
Businesses are going to potentially lose 14 hours a week where they can make money. There should probably be some consideration for an adjustment in the cost of the licenses.
I mean, New York City goes until 4 a.m., Chicago goes until 5 a.m., Boston goes until 2. And I can't remember the last time they all got together and said, in order to curb violent crimes or any other types of offense, why don't we restrict people who are doing business responsibly?
I think that if you're saying that you want to close bars an hour early to avoid the trouble that happens at 2 a.m., we're just going to have people going out a little earlier and creating the same problems at 1 a.m.
I kind of feel like there's already plenty of laws to prevent people from beating each other up and screaming and yelling at 2 o'clock in the morning and all that stuff. I think we'd probably just shift the problem. I'm sure that people would drink faster if they thought they had to get it done sooner.
I think the solution would be to go after the businesses that are the big violators, make sure that they're held accountable. If people have dozens of police calls, there's a reason for it.
So one potential solution that has worked in other cities is to have almost like a staggered closing time, where it's over the space of 2 to 3 hours at different establishments, and that way not everybody is out into the streets at the same time at 2 a.m. I feel like if you can dilute just the quantities of people that are leaving establishments at the same time, then it inevitably would help.
Getting the officers out on foot, going up to the different crowds of people, which I've seen firsthand, and sort of breaking them up so they're not standing, getting frustrated. Once you break them up, they sort of walk away. They don't get in the fights and cause the violence that has occurred.
Lowell City Councilor Rodney Elliott requested a motion at the February 4th City Council meeting to have bars closed by midnight and have patrons out by 1 a.m. After a lengthy discussion, the motion was sent to the Public Safety Subcommittee, where it will be debated upon again. There's a lot of confusion regarding the future of the Saints campus of Lowell General Hospital. There are rumors that LGH may close the Saints emergency room, the intensive care unit, and the entire campus altogether. In this next segment, we hear from LGH leadership to find out exactly what's happening regarding Saints.
One of the questions we get asked most frequently since 2012 is what's happening at the Saints campus, and is the Saints campus closing? And we say absolutely and very strongly no. The Saints campus is a vibrant part of our local health system. We see over 40,000 patients in the Saints campus emergency department and have 2 very large, busy inpatient units, and we're completely committed to maintaining care and services at that campus. In recent years, we've seen a reduction in our critical care volume at the Saints campus. At the same time, in 2018, we opened the Gillen Maryland Campbell ICU here on the main campus and refurbished our old ICU on the main campus, giving us 23 state-of-the-art ICU beds at this campus with declining volume at the Saints campus. So we did make the decision this last summer to consolidate our critical care program to the main campus. One of the questions we're often asked is the emergency department at the Saints campus closing? And the answer is quite the opposite, that we have a very vibrant, very busy emergency department at the Saints campus that sees over 40,000 residents a year, and we continue to be extremely committed to that campus. Since 2012, many programs have been consolidated at either the main campus or the Saints campus. One example of a program that consolidated to the main campus in 2012 is our cardiac cath lab. So since 2012, any patient that presented to the Saints campus having a heart attack or needing treatment in the cath lab has been transported over here by ambulance. So that's a process that's been going on since 2012. And one of the things that's very important to emphasize is that we've put many systems and processes in place in collaboration with our outstanding medical staff to make sure that those patients have no interruption in care.
We have put many systems in place to ensure exceptional care of our patients when they present to either of our campuses. So if a patient who needs cardiovascular interventions presents to the Saints campus, we've worked very closely with our emergency department physicians and our specialists such as cardiologists and our staff where we have processes and procedures and they get here in a timely fashion. We have, the door to balloon times are better than the national average, so we provide exceptional care to the patients no matter which campus they present to. And the medical staff are the same medical staff at both campuses. The emergency department has staff that are shared between both emergency departments, so it's the same level of care no matter which area they present to.
To our community, we say we are so extraordinarily grateful and take the responsibility of providing care to our community very seriously. And community members don't really need to overthink it. They can present at either one of our hospital campuses or present to EMS, and with our EMS partners or with our emergency departments, we will be able to facilitate the care and service they need. So we don't want the community to worry or think about which campus do I need to go to. Just activate EMS or present to one of our emergency departments and we will take care of you.
In this week's Sunspot, Lowell Sun Enterprise editor Chris Scott sits down with Massachusetts State Senator Diana DiZoglio.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Chris Scott, the Enterprise editor at The Sun. Thank you for tuning in to I believe this is the 111th edition of Sunspot. We have a new guest with us this week. It is State Senator Diana DiZoglio. Diana, thank you for coming in. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
Diana is from Methuen, which is a little bit out of our comfort zone here at the Lowell Telecommunications Corp. But she's currently embroiled in quite a row with the Speaker of the House of Massachusetts and the Governor concerning a statewide issue, which I find fascinating, so I appreciate you coming in. Tell us, what exactly is a non-disclosure agreement?
A non-disclosure agreement is an agreement that requires confidentiality that's normally been used and that was originally intended to be used in cases where there is a trade secret that needs to be kept or there's some sort of intellectual property that needs to be kept private. What's been happening in recent years...
We're not talking trade secrets here.
Right, we're not talking trade secrets here. Yeah. What's happened in recent years has been due to the Me Too movement. We found out that these non-disclosure agreements, which were originally intended to protect intellectual property, have been instead used to cover up abuse and predatory behavior. We've heard about the Harvey Weinstein incidents. We've heard about the Larry Nassar incidents with the U.S. gymnastics team. We've heard about the Steve Wynn incidents. In all of these cases, these predators, these sexual predators, were able to move from one victim, one unsuspecting victim, to the next because they were using non-disclosure agreements to purchase the silence of their victims in order to be able to cover up what they were doing. So they were able to be violent with people, they were able to abuse people, and then cover it up with an NDA, move on to the next victim, give the next person an NDA, move on to the next victim, so on and so forth. What happened in the Catholic Church is the priests that were abusing young children, doing unspeakable acts, were able to move from one child victim to the next by covering up what they were doing using these non-disclosure agreements. A lot of people don't know how they were able to get away with the hundreds, and then we found out thousands of child sexual abuse cases that were exposed years ago. The tool that they used to cover up that sexual abuse and move easily from one child victim to the next with the family having no understanding that they were sending their child off to be in the care of a sexual predator was the non-disclosure agreement. These non-disclosure agreements are being used in our state government as well. I filed a bill to ban the use of taxpayer dollars from being used towards non-disclosure agreements because a lot of people don't know this, but our elected officials are able to use the same non-disclosure agreements that the priests used in the sexual abuse clergy cases, and they're able to use the same non-disclosure agreements that Harvey Weinstein, Steve Wynn, and Larry Nassar used in their sex abuse cases. Our elected officials are able to use these in our state government as well. I'm concerned about the victims across the board, whether they're working in state government, whether they're working in local government, whether they're working anywhere in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, private sector or public sector.
Why do you believe that the Speaker of the House and the Governor, and we're talking off air about the Governor too on this particular matter, are so adamantly opposed to what you're trying to accomplish here?
Because the Speaker and the Governor both use non-disclosure agreements in their offices and in their respective organizations.
Why is it so important to them that the status quo remain?
That's a question for them.
Why do you think that is?
They've used the need for victim confidentiality in order to argue that they need to be able to continue to use non-disclosure agreements. They say, well, non-disclosure agreements protect the victim. That is not true. Non-disclosure agreements protect the perpetrator and allow them to move easily from one victim to the next.
So do you think that their concern really is about the perpetrator? Because I believe it's not about the victim. I believe that they want to that and this is my conspiratorial side, which has developed over years in the media. It may sound outrageous, but I think they're concerned about trying to tamp down any negative press on someone, in the House of Representatives or someone in the state Senate or someone anywhere.
Well, clearly they think that it's appropriate to use taxpayer dollars to cover up the inappropriate actions that are going on at the State House. Otherwise, they wouldn't be using these non-disclosure agreements.
How prevalent is this at the State House? I know, you have firsthand knowledge here. Something happened to you there, and I wished we had more time to get into that, but you've seen it, you've lived it. Like, what is it, like Animal House up there?
I will tell you that the culture of the House of Representatives is one that's very toxic.
Is it still that way?
It is still that way. It was that way when I worked there as a legislative aide years ago. It was a very toxic culture and environment, and it is still a very toxic culture. I have since moved on to the state Senate. It's not the same experience that I'm having in the state Senate that I had when I was working in the House of Representatives, but...
Can you give us an example of the toxic culture that you say is prevalent in the state?
Yes, if you in the House of Representatives, sure. If you take a position against a speaker and you publicly challenge him in any way, shape, or form, you are ostracized, your bills will be held up, your chairmanship will be taken away. Unfortunately, that is something that happens all too often when reps take a stand and they fight for an issue that's important to them. They are immediately shown that this is what happens. There's an example set. A person comes forward, they say that they have an issue with something that the Speaker is doing or that the leadership of the House of Representatives is doing, and as soon as they make a statement that challenges the status quo, they are immediately stripped of their title, stripped of their position. It's very difficult for them to get things that they need for their district, and there's an example set that this is what happens when you go against the Speaker of the House.
Do you think there ought to be term limits for the Speaker?
Absolutely. I was one of the dissenting votes when the Speaker lifted the term limits on himself, and I was very vocal about the fact that I disagreed with his lifting the term limits on himself. He said it himself years ago that there's no room for growth and change in the House of Representatives if the Speaker of the House doesn't have term limits. He changed his mind a couple of years ago and decided that he wanted to continue to stay on with no term limits, and I hear that he's running again, and I think that that's very unfortunate for the House of Representatives.
Did you file this measure when you were actually in the House, or is this something that came when you were a senator?
I filed the particular measure that we're talking about today as a state senator. Okay. I had filed another provision when I was a House member. This is a Senate bill, that was a House bill. And the bill's been working its way through the process. I've made every attempt to work on this legislation.
Yeah, where does it stand
with
right
both
now?
The governor and the legislature to get it through the process, and it's been held up in committee, and it looks like it's about to go to study once again.
Which means it's just going off into purgatory.
Which means that they are sending it to purgatory, but which means I have another hurdle that I have to jump over. I'm prepared to jump over that hurdle, and I'm going to continue to fight for victims and for workers across Massachusetts.
When I called you last week to set up the show, we talked a little bit about who supports this and who doesn't, and I asked you about the Senate President, Karen Spilka, and you told me she is supportive. Is that correct?
She has been supportive of this at every opportunity that we've had to vote on this on the Senate floor. We passed a provision in the state Senate to ban the use of non-disclosure agreements amongst our own members and to prohibit the use of taxpayer dollars in those scenarios. She was fully supportive. The minority leader, Senator Bruce Tarr, was fully supportive. Every Republican and every Democrat in the state Senate voted to ban the use of taxpayer-funded hush agreements, known as non-disclosure agreements, in the state Senate. But we cannot get this passed in the House or get it to the governor's desk without the Speaker of the House's approval and without the governor's approval.
Which committee in the House would this fall to?
This is currently in the Judiciary Committee.
And who's the chairman of the Judiciary Committee?
It is Senators Eldridge and Representative Cronin.
How does Senator Eldridge feel? Because I ask you specifically about him. He's one of our senators from Greater Lowell. He represents a wide swath of territory out on the Western Front.
I know that Senator
He's
Eldridge...
He's a liberal guy, and I would think that he would embrace something like this.
Well, I can't speak to his position on any bill. This is something that's going through the committee process as we speak. Tomorrow is the bill reporting deadline, but I will say that he voted to ban the use of non-disclosure agreements in the state Senate, and I would be hopeful that he would be supportive of this provision
I'd like
in
to
order
get back
to
to
expand
DeLeo
that.
for a second.
Certainly.
Have you ever had a private audience with DeLeo to plead your case?
No.
Say, have you tried to get that?
Yes.
And what happens?
I am given an opportunity to speak with House leadership, generally a female member of his leadership team.
Who would that be?
Will speak with me about something.
But who is that?
Depending on who is assigned to come and have the conversation with me. But there have been no conversations had with House leadership in any capacity in something that would be able to produce results since I came forward and broke my non-disclosure agreement that the Speaker gave me last year.
This Speaker?
Yes. Yes.
You seem so resolute on this issue, and I admire that. How far are you prepared to go on this? Just by talking to you over the course of the last few days.
I'm prepared to do whatever it takes to get this legislation across the finish line. Having personal experience with being given a non-disclosure agreement from the Speaker of the House where I didn't have an option, where it was required of me, and that was a taxpayer-funded severance package years ago. I know firsthand what it's like to have to sign one of these things. And it's absolutely unacceptable that the Speaker of the House, who's in a very powerful position, would require these things of victims of harassment, discrimination, assault, or anything else that's happening in that House chamber. So I'm prepared to do whatever it takes to continue to highlight this very important issue.
What do you hear from your constituents in the 1st Essex District on
My
this
constituents are all supportive of this. I haven't heard one complaint about this bill going through the process. If anything, they've been very supportive, strong advocates for this proposal. The issue comes in the House of Representatives and in the Baker administration, where you have the governor and the Speaker of the House dead set on continuing to be able to use taxpayer-funded non-disclosure agreements, not wanting to give up that power to be able to use these silencing agreements, and that's what's holding this conversation up.
We'll be back in 2 weeks with another guest. Have a good night, everyone.
And that's all for this edition of LTC News. You can find us on LTC channels 8, 95, and 99, online at ltc.org, on Roku in the LTC News playlist, on Facebook at LTC Lowell, or on our YouTube page. We leave you now with an excerpt from the Lowell Chamber Orchestra's Grand Chamber Music Concert. I'm your host, Krista Brown. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.